That's what this book is for, you know. It's a terrific guidance to everybody. For everybody, this book will guide you to the real Jesus.
Okay, on that, and I want to get down to some nitty-gritty of what people say. Now, for instance, I've heard many people say, yes, they accept Jesus was a historical figure.
Good start.
But he was just a man, or even they would go, he was just a prophet. In other words, they won't put the spiritual aspect to him. They won't take this idea, which we'll look at in just a minute, of his death, because obviously if there's a birth and for salvation, obviously that's going to be culminating in his death. But they don't take any of that. But yes, he was a good man. Yeah, therefore, obviously, the things that are written in that book that he said, many of them will be true. Some of them will probably be. And after all, I mean, there are differences in the Gospels, therefore, you know. And so they will go through all of this. How do you begin to, and say that person's open, because obviously if you're not open, you can't go anywhere at that point, because they're going to, but if they're open to discuss and they're open to having input into, where do you go with that? Okay, the fact that Jesus is just a man or just a prophet, where do you start by showing them there's something more?
Well, the first thing I would do is to pose my own question, and I would say, well, where do you get that idea from? Because 99.9% plus of the things we know about Jesus are written in this document, in this book we call the Bible. So if you have come to a decision that Jesus is this but not this, where have you got that from? Because it's not from here. This is the document that tells you about Jesus. There are other historians who have told us that Jesus existed. So now we know outside of this that Jesus is an historical character. We know this to be true because it's in other historical books. But these other historical books don't tell you about the life and times of Jesus himself. Only this book does that. Only these eyewitnesses have done that. So where have you got the idea that Jesus is this but not this? And usually people cannot answer that question because they haven't really read up on it. Most people who would come to you with this sort of statement have no clues. They just want to believe what they want to believe because it's easier to believe that. When they're sitting in front of me and you or any other Christian, it's easier to believe that Jesus is an historical character, even a good man and a great teacher, possibly even a prophet will go that far. But the Son of God who takes away the sins of the world, now we'll stop there because now you're getting personal. And that's what people do. They've got no real understanding of the situation at all. So having done that, we've got to the point where... And so, well, I mean, I know many people would come back and say, well, so-and-so told me, you know, and they could mention, you know, a name of a very famous atheist or agnostic or something like that. Or I read it in this quite learned book. Yes. In other words, you know, they may come back to you with that. And what is interesting, of course, is probably they can't come back with any proof of working it out, but they can come back. So if they come back with that sort of statement, okay, so-and-so, I read it in so-and-so's book. You know, this is... Where do you go at that point then? After they to the book, I want to see the book. I want to see the book they read it from. I want to see what's very important in these things is there are two important things actually. It's not to belittle, first of all, the philosophy that's put in front of you. As daft as there's a lot of daft philosophies out there, and I can sit and I can smirk and I can smile and think, oh, you know, you really haven't thought this through, have you? but secondly, it's important to get people to think about what they're saying. Now, you know, one of the most famous atheists of our day is Richard Dawkins, of course, and everybody holds him up to be a very intelligent man and very bright man. He's got more letters after his name than he's got in his name. But sit down and listen to what he's saying, and actually, most of the stuff that he's saying about the faith, at least, is absolute rubbish. So I would challenge the source. I would just challenge the source. I think I've already said it, but I would challenge the source of that information. You can read it in any number of books, but where did those number of books get their information from? Because it wasn't from here, And it wasn't from the other historians, Pliny or Josephus or Tacitus. It wasn't from any of them, because they don't say those things. There is absolutely no evidence. What we have to do is talk about Jesus as a historical character. We have to look at history. Now, where do we get any of our history from? It's from eyewitness accounts of people who wrote it down at the time. Now, most of history, or the books and the pamphlets and the paraphernalia that we've got that is called history, especially ancient history, which is what we're talking about here, are copies of copies of copies. Okay?
But we accept it, don't we?
But we accept it. We accept it as true because it mostly doesn't impinge on us as a person.
Right.
We can believe
Julius
Caesar and the Gaelic Wars, even though the best copy we've got, it was written 900 years after the event. That's the best we've got. We haven't got a handwritten copy from the day of the event. It's 900. It's just a copy of a copy of a copy. Any number of imperfections could have got in there because it's just a copy of a copy. 900 years, I believe. But when it comes to this particular history of this particular man called Jesus, it gets personal, and that's why people start making things up as they go along. But we have to nail. If you're talking about history, then you have to use historical documents. Mm-hmm. And the only historical documents that gives you any insight into the life of Jesus is the Bible. Mm. So where we have to go from there is to look really at the Bible and to prove to people, because most people then will say, yeah, but the Bible is just a book of myths and legends and folklore and nice stories about things. So we have to go on from there then to prove that this book is actually a historical document and is trustworthy as such. And we have to go there. We have to go there before we go anywhere else, because people will otherwise make things up as they go. Even people in the church make things up as they go along, for goodness sake.
In other words, what you're saying, and it's real, but most people have double standards, aren't they? And it's very interesting. You said it a couple of times, and I think it's right. It's not simply because it's called the Bible. No. It's not simply because but what it is if I do believe that is true, then it has a real effect on my life. Mm-hmm. If I believe Julius Caesar or Henry VIII or whatever, what they did, I may still be living it, but it's not really going to affect my life. I haven't got to suddenly change my life because I accept Julius Caesar or I accept Henry VIII.
It's just history, yeah.
But if I accept that book is true, then my life changes.
It's very, very personal.
And therefore you tend to say, forget it, without going. But what you are saying is that is actually historically more reliable than most other documents that we accept and which are studied in universities as historical documents.
Yes.
And I find that a very interesting point to make.
Well, I've got a few things written down on that point.
You've got 25 pages there.
All these pages I've got. I don't know what I was doing. Bertrand Russell, probably the most famous atheist of his time, particularly because he was the most outspoken atheist of his time and made a lot of money out of it. He says, and I quote, "Historically, it's quite doubtful whether Christ ever existed at all." And this is where you get a lot of this from, because somebody like Bertrand Russell stood up and said it. Oh, see, that's the easy way out. Christ didn't even exist. There was a short period of time, going back perhaps 20 years ago, where it was the in thing to say, well, okay, we know Jesus existed, because any historian knows that's a really stupid thing to say, and Bertrand Russell was showing his ignorance in spades by saying that. So they started having a go at the writers. You see, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul, and well, these people didn't exist. So, you know, there was a bit of wily as a serpent and not very gentle at all going on there. But Bertrand Russell really was the beginning of this in modern times. Historically, he says it's quite doubtful whether Christ ever existed at all, and if he did, we don't know anything about him. So I'm not concerned with the historical question, which is very difficult. I'm concerned with Christ as he appears in the gospel.